Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everyone to the next seminar in Te Puna Haumaru seminar series. Today I'm really excited to have you all here to listen to me, for once, speak alongside my colleagues, Dr. Jacinta Cording from University of Canterbury and Professor Devon Polaschek from University of Waikato. So since I'm speaking today, I'll introduce myself properly. So ko tongarero te maunga, ko te arawa te waka, ko tūwharetoa te iwi, e noho ana ahau e te taha o te awa o Waikato, ko Apriel tōku ingoa. So I whakapapa to the area just south of Taupo. I grew up in South Auckland and I live and work in the Waikato area. And I'm a lecturer at Te Puna Haumaru, which is the New Zealand Institute for Security and Crime Science. And I'll hand over to Jacinta to introduce herself.
Kia ora koutou. Ko mai ki tere te maunga ko Rakahuri te awa no Rangiora ahau. He pukinga mātua ki te whariwānanga o Waitaha. Ko Jacinta Cording tōku ingoa. Thank you very much. Nice to see you all here today. As April said, I've been part of this research project with Apriel and Devon. So I'm based at the University of Canterbury and grew up in Rangiora. So thanks so much for coming along. I'll pass it over to Devon.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Devon Polaschek, tōku ingoa no o kahi ahau. I'm Devon Polaschek. I am the current director of Te Puna Haumaru, the New Zealand Institute of Security and Crime Science, which is hosting the seminar series. I grew up in Tahi, but I've been in Hamilton now for 7 years, I think, after a stint in Wellington. And so great to have an opportunity to talk to you today. So today we're actually going to report back to you on some research we've been doing for a little while, based on some data that we were able to work with from the Ministry of Justice. So by way of a bit of an introduction, I'm just going to talk about the background to the issue of reporting, and then the others will talk about what we actually did. So starting with this lovely iceberg, it's really there to remind us about the dark figure of crime, which is a well-known and well-understood concept in criminology today. But like an iceberg, it refers to the notion that crime that is officially known about, and by that we often mean typically the crime that's reported to police, is a relatively small proportion of what's really happening. So it's quite interesting that it wasn't really until the 1970s, when the first large crime surveys started to be done, that we really had an idea of the extent of the figure that was unknown, if you like, the dark figure. I think the first large crime and victimisation survey was done in the US, and they've progressed since there. Understanding the extent of officially unreported crime, as it began to grow, so too did our understanding of how important victims are as gatekeepers in the criminal justice system. But consequently, how victims make decisions about who to tell and how to access help has become, quite a focus of research since that time. Fascinatingly, though, a lot of research has been from the kind of criminal-centric perspective of the system itself. So the official or wider society perspective tends to be that reporting crime is an important thing to do. It facilitates the functioning of a system with the job of apprehending and prosecuting perpetrators, so that they can be incapacitated or deterred or punished. And it's considered something of a moral responsibility or a kind of right thing to do to report crime. And it's also often said that victims can't be properly helped if they don't report crime. So consequently, the question that's asked is most often, why don't victims report crimes, rather than the inverse, why do they report? And the importance of this question is quite evident when we understand that when people are victimised, there's often a substantial gap between the assertions of the legal system about the benefits of reporting and the reality that victims often experience, including how well they're treated in the process of gathering evidence and conducting the investigation, and whether they're being kept informed of the progress of their case, and whether the outcomes are timely or satisfying or do result, for example, in increasing their safety. So an overseas study in 2020 suggested that victims generally do not feel that their needs are met by the criminal justice system, which instead is really more preoccupied with attributing blame for and punishing isolated acts of wrongdoing. And so consequently, in practice, it's far from being a given that victims will benefit from reporting, and it's now a bit better understood that victims conduct some form of cost-benefit analysis in order to inform their decision of whether to report officially or not. So just as there are ecological models of predictors of violence, there are also, you can organise predictors of reporting in multiple layers of what might be viewed as an ecological model, including things like neighbourhood characteristics, victim and perpetrator characteristics, the relationships between them, the perceptions of police and the criminal justice system for them, for their families and their neighbourhoods, but of course also including event characteristics, so things like the degree of injury of the victim, whether a weapon was used, whether the victim had been using alcohol and drugs during the event or prior to it, all affect reporting. Some other factors that aren't always so obvious is that reporting can lead to a perception of loss of agency. So that may discourage people from reporting because they want to deal with matters their own way. And sometimes that's for retaliation, to avoid a retaliation issue, or it can be just because they don't think it warrants that kind of attention. And relatedly, we have quite a few groups in society who effectively don't have good access to the protection of the criminal justice system because of their demographic or other status. So people like illegal immigrants and also people involved in criminal activities and enterprises or using illegal drugs. So there's a lot of research on predictors, but much less on the psychological models that might help us understand what these predictors are indicators of. So one of the things you'll see in our research today is that we've got access to a range of markers or a range of things that we could regard as indices of something. And so as psychological researchers in particular, we're really interested in thinking about what are those markers of? And so what are the psychological processes or psychosocial processes that help us understand better what that decision-making process is for people who are reporting or not? And there are several models that have been proposed for this decision-making process. One proposed by Finkelhor at the turn of the century is a simple two-stage model. And Finkelhor proposed that the first step is recognising that a crime has occurred, and the second step is considering what to do, weighing up the pros and cons of reporting. And that second step is affected by one's own experiences with police and those of friends and family, as well as such issues as whether or not police will treat them fairly, whether police have time to respond to this type of crime. So sometimes, the peer group will actually say, you reported that. Like, why would you do that? Because they never had time to pay attention to that. And again, whether they belong to a group with characteristics that lead to poor treatment from police, such as ethnically marginalised groups, or those involved in crime themselves, but also considerations of how much time it will take to be involved and whether there'll be a good outcome. But the picture's a bit more complicated, especially for family and sexual violence, which is what we're focusing on today. So generally speaking, the first step actually may be a lot more complicated than simply knowing what counts as a crime. So it's been known for quite a long time that people will frequently deny being a victim of various types of crime, while they're at the same time agreeing that they've had the experience that meets the legal definition of that crime, which is why most modern crime surveys ask people about experiences rather than using labels like assault. But recognising that a crime has been committed, obviously in part noticing that something's happened, as in when you say to your housemates, has anyone seen the toaster? And it turns out it's just not there. Or, I thought I parked my car here, but it's not here. So did I, or did I park it somewhere else? So detecting crime in a basic way. But for interpersonal crime, knowing what the legal definition of a crime is can be important. So people simply might not think, for example, that they've experienced a sexual assault if they didn't put up physical resistance. However, a third factor that's not always considered is that people are actually highly motivated to avoid labelling themselves as victims in the first place because of social stigma, particularly for crimes like family and sexual violence. Even informal social supports may not react to being informed in a supportive way. They may have their own negative reactions that get in the way of supporting and helping the person who's had the experience. But the person themselves also can be highly motivated to preserve their pre-existing beliefs about things like a just world. So consequently, people will decide not to report crime because they refuse to see what has happened to them as victimisation, or they downplay the severity of it. So when these factors are taken into account, reporting may occur in circumstances where it's more difficult to discount that you've been victimised. For example, when there's a high level of injury, or the person has not been able to suppress or cope with the resulting emotional distress. And so this research showing that these are predictors of reporting. Finally, it's often argued that victim wellbeing is at stake when victims don't report. Some researchers refer to calling the police as a form of help seeking, but as we've already noted, a variety of factors may work against that idea, and victims may actually secure better help from family and friends or from specialist agencies that are accessible to them without a police report. If we assume that there will always be a dark figure of crime, then comparing wellbeing outcomes for people who do and do not report is also an important part of understanding whether the needs of non-reporters are being met in regard to wellbeing, or to put it the other way, whether we should be encouraging people to, as we often do, to report. So that's it from me.
Yeah, so I don't think I now need to explain that sexual violence and family violence are, crimes that cause a lot of harm to our society, and that therefore governments, researchers, NGOs, a broad range of society are focused on trying to eliminate those forms of harm from our communities. So this is also the case in Aotearoa, of course, where over the years we've had multiple joint ventures or ministerial groups that have tried to reduce the level of this form of harm in our community. And as part of this, a large focus is on trying to, better understand the forms of harm that are happening out there in our communities so that we can develop interventions or ideally preventative initiatives that will stop that harm from occurring. So a lot of this is based on things that we know about family violence and sexual violence from administrative data sets. So that might be arrests, it might be convictions, perhaps it's reports to police. But as Devon pointed out, we know that this picture falls well short of capturing everything that's going out there, or even a majority of what form of harm is happening within our community, because of that resistance to or inability to report these forms of harm to authorities. And so what it means is that our administrative databases are based largely on formal reports to authorities such as police and don't capture the hidden figure of what's going on in our communities. So for instance, the New Zealand Crime and Victim Survey suggests that only about a third of offences committed by family members are reported to the police. And as you'll see from our research that we're just about to present, that number is significantly lower for sexual violence, that it's really only a tiny portion of sexual harm that is reported to authorities. The other thing, as Devon mentioned, was that we assume that reporting to authorities means better outcomes for the victims or survivors of these forms of harm, but that's not always a given. So we really don't know that much about the different trajectories that victims or survivors take beyond an offence and whether that's impacted by reporting or not. So we would hope that perhaps there are better outcomes if people report to police or other authorities. But as Devon said, perhaps these people are getting the supports that they need through more informal sources, whether that be friends or family or other NGOs that don't require engagement with the criminal justice system. So that's another thing that prompted our research, was trying to better understand the well-being of victims or survivors, depending on whether or not they'd reported that harm. So now we're going to talk about the study that we conducted. So really driven by trying to better understand, first of all, what are the factors that we can identify that are related to people reporting sexual violence or family violence to police or other authorities? And then second of all, can we see any differences in the well-being of those who do and don't report to police? So we had a unique opportunity in our study to address this by using a survey called the New Zealand Crime and Victim Survey, which is run by the Ministry of Justice. So this is an annual nationwide face-to-face survey. So it's conducted across New Zealand. Households are randomly selected, and one person aged 15 or over in that household is interviewed. So it's designed to be somewhat representative, but with oversampling for populations of interest. So whether that be Māori, for instance, are oversampled within the survey population. It focuses on crime that's happened in the previous 12 months, or there are a couple of questions about lifetime experiences of sexual violence, for instance. And the other key thing is that it focuses on behavioural indicators, so things like within the past 12 months, has a family member ever pushed you, or something along those lines, rather than, as Devon pointed out, saying, have you ever been a victim of family violence, which some people may not identify as applying to them, even when it may be the case. So we were able to combine this self-reported measure of crime, which ideally, and we know again, there'll be people who don't report everything that happened to them, but ideally it gets at some of those hidden forms of violence that's happening in our communities, and then partners that with administrative data that we pulled in from the integrated data infrastructure. So the IDI, if you're not familiar with this, is a data set that's managed by Statistics New Zealand. And basically what it does is it holds data at the individual level on every resident of Aotearoa. So pulls in data from a wide range of ministries, so justice, health, education, MSD, as well as some NGO providers as well, and some of the broader census data, for instance. So it's just a really, I would say it's a really wide range of variables that are captured within the database, although as you'll see, perhaps it lacks depth in some areas, but it did enable us to get a broader picture of what might be going on in the lives of people who reported family violence or sexual violence through the Crime and Victim Survey. So we were able to link them at the respondent level. And I'll pass it over to Apriel now.
Awesome. Thank you both for that introduction. Now I'm going to jump in and just talk us through what we did for answering the first research question, which asked what person, community, or offence-related factors are associated with whether victims choose to report family or sexual violence to police. So to answer this question, we had two samples, but I'll talk you through first what we did with the family violence sample. So we identified respondents of the New Zealand Crime and Victim Survey who had experienced offences by family members, and there were just over 1,000 people. Then we collated their personal and offence factors from forms that they'd answered in the survey. So people could answer multiple forms if they'd had multiple experiences of crime. So we collated across those. Next, we identified whether or not they reported any of those offences to police, and here we were interested in whether it was the victim themselves who chose to report. Then we identified and linked additional personal and community factors from the integrated data infrastructure. And finally, to answer the research questions, we looked at the associations between those factors and whether or not people reported any of the offences they experienced. And we followed that same method for the analysis with the sample of people who had experienced sexual violence offences. We had just over 700 people in that sample. And something important to note is that these samples could overlap slightly. So if someone experienced a sexual offence where the offender was a family member, it would also be in the family violence sample. But if someone experienced a sexual offence that was by a non-family member, then they'd be in the sexual violence sample and not in the family violence sample. So you might be interested in what factors we actually looked at. So addressing these by the levels that we looked at, so personal, community, and offence factors. From the New Zealand Crime and Victim Survey, we looked at personal factors including age, disability, gender, multiple ethnicities, which people could select more than one, as well as sexual orientation. And from the IDI, we were also able to know if leading up to the survey period and the period beforehand, people had received a benefit, their deprivation score, which was weighted across addresses that they'd had previously, their mood prescriptions, AOD service use, and non-AOD service use. So getting more at wellbeing there. As well as social housing and many other health, police, oranga tamariki indicators. When we look at community factors, we had from the New Zealand Crime and Victim Survey, we were able to tell whether people lived in an urban or rural area. And from the IDI, we could get neighbourhood deprivation, so the average deprivation level of the areas that they'd lived in based on their previous addresses, as well as victimisation, so how much victimisation was being reported in the area where they lived. Finally, we looked at factors related to the offence itself. So from the New Zealand Crime and Victim Survey, all of these related to the survey actually, but factors that were recorded for both samples were whether any of the offenders were women, whether the victim ever viewed those offences as crime, the maximum severity of those offences, the most severe injury they experienced, as well as the number of times they were injured. For the family violence sample, we also looked at whether any of the offenders were not an intimate partner and how many experiences of physical offences and threat offences they'd had. And for the sexual violence sample, we looked at whether any of the offenders were not family, and we looked at the number of 4 different types of sexual violence offences. So the sample characteristics, they were a little bit different from each other. The mean age of the family violence sample was a bit older. We've got roughly 3/4 women for family violence and roughly 4/5 women for sexual violence. The samples have higher rates of Māori. That's partly also because the Crime and Victim Survey has the extra sampling for Māori, as Jacinta explained earlier. And when we looked at reporting, about 1/3 of the people in the sample reported for family violence, with 2/5 being reported by anyone. So that includes the victim or someone else. And for sexual violence, only just under 10% of victims reported and 12% were reported by anyone. So it would help if I actually answered the research question. So what did we find? We first just looked at bivariate association. So that's when you just take that one characteristic and look at the association that it has with your outcome variable. So when we looked at the person level characteristics, we found that women, people who received benefits, lived in social housing, had previous sensitive claims, had previous pain prescriptions, and had a higher number of total previous addresses and victimizations were more likely to report to police, and people who experienced high levels of deprivation were less likely to report. When we looked at the community factors, we found people who lived in areas with greater deprivation and victimizations were more likely to report. And with offence-related factors, we found people were more likely to report if they had ever viewed the offences as a crime, if they were more severely injured, and experienced more physical and threat offences and were injured more often. Then what we did was we wanted to know, well, are these variables really explaining something? So we put them in a model together. So we looked at all of the person-based variables together to look at what stood out as the best predictors of whether or not people would choose to report. And you can see, so fewer things came out of that. So when we put all the person-based characteristics in a model together, it came out that the best predictors of whether or not someone would report is whether they were women who had received benefits, were living in social housing, had pain prescriptions, and a higher number of victimizations. With community characteristics, only neighbourhood deprivation stood out, and with offence characteristics, only viewing offences as crime, having them be more severe, and having a greater number of threat offences were associated with increased odds of reporting, whereas number of physical offences in the combined model was associated with decreased odds. Then we took those significant predictors, put them in a model together. So this is an overall look at what stands out as the best predictors of victims choosing to report family violence. And so you can see if they have a higher number on this slide, it's greater odds of choosing to report. And they're all associated with greater odds, with the best predictors being the number of victimizations someone had experienced and whether or not they viewed the offences as being crime. So now moving on to sexual violence, we did the same thing. So the first step was those bivariate associations, so just looking at individual variables and whether they were associated with reporting. At the person level, we had many that were associated with greater reporting, some similar to the family violence sample, but some different. So for example, we have AOD service use and previous reports of concern. Employment was associated with lower likelihood. None of the community level factors were associated at this level for sexual violence. And looking at the offence characteristics, we have a same kind of pattern here where we've got being viewed as crime and more severe injuries and being associated with greater likelihood. And we also see here that having a non-family member offender was associated with decreased likelihood. So people were more likely to report when it was family. So next we did the multivariate analysis. Only one variable stood out as a predictor of reporting when we combined all of the person level characteristics, and that was whether or not someone had lived in social housing prior to the survey period. There were no community factors that stood out. And at the offence level, we have viewing it as a crime and experience more severe injury or more severe incidents, as well as the number of offences people had where people were threatening to sexually assault them. And here's the combined model for sexual violence. So these are the factors that stood out as the greatest predictors of victims' decisions to report who had experienced sexual violence. You can see here that they're all associated with increased odds of reporting, and that the variable with the greatest relationship was whether or not people viewed what had happened to them as crime. So now we'll look at wellbeing outcomes, and I'll hand over to Jacinta.
The second thing that we were looking at was, were there any differences in wellbeing outcomes for people who did and didn't report the family or sexual violence that they'd experienced? So in this case, we identified the number of people who had experienced family violence offences from the New Zealand Crime and Victims Survey. But in this case, because we wanted to look at outcomes, we then created a matched sample. So we matched a sample of people who had reported with people who hadn't reported, and then compared their outcomes. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the matching in a second. But basically what that did was, obviously it shrinks down the number of people in our analysis now, because we have to have a one-to-one match with people who reported. And because only a third reported, that shrinks down. So there were around 300 people in each group. Then we identified, using the Crime and Victims Survey, some of the outcomes that we would be interested in measuring, matched them on with outcomes we'd be interested in from the IDI, and then had a look at whether those outcomes differed between our two groups. We did the exact same thing for sexual violence, but what you'll note is the very small sample size here, so only 72 people in each group for sexual violence. And again, that's because of such low rates of reporting among this group, naturally reduced our ability to be able to create matched groups who had and hadn't reported. So we used a technique called propensity score matching in order to do the matching, and this is basically a bit of statistical wizardry, which it sort of approximates a randomized control design. So obviously typically what people consider to be one of the better forms of assessing differences between groups is to randomly assign people to one group or the other. Obviously, we're not able to randomly assign people to whether they report something to the police or not. So instead, we use this method of using the factors that we identified in the previous research question about the things that predict someone reporting. We take those factors, like the severity of the crime, for instance, or the level of deprivation, and we match people based on those. So we take a group of reporters who look the same as the non-reporters in terms of their likelihood of reporting. So based on previous characteristics, we would expect them to have the same likelihood of reporting. It's just that one reported and one didn't. And so in that respect, it kind of approximates a design where you've randomly assigned people to report or not. Is basically what's going on. And so then we're able to compare actual outcomes between our two groups. So when we did that, we looked at things from the Crime and Victim Survey, such as life satisfaction following the incident, levels of psychological distress following the incident, and time off work. And then we pulled in some additional indicators from the IDI. So you'll note that these look quite similar to some of the things that we looked at in terms of predictors of reporting. It's just that these were measured in the year following the survey period. So these are the things that happened after the offending was reported. So coming back to what were the differences that we found in terms of wellbeing outcomes. So if we look at family violence, the only difference in outcomes for victims of family violence was time off work. So there was a small difference in that people who reported crime had higher rates of time off work than people who didn't. One thing I forgot to mention, sorry, is that this is whether anyone reported the offence. So this is whether the offence came to the attention of the authorities by anyone reporting it. It's no longer just the victim. And the reason for that is that we wanted to control for, well, maybe they're getting access to services because someone else reported the offending. So in this case, the only difference was that time off work, which might relate, for instance, to the family violence leave legislation. Could be, but we don't really know what's going on there. In terms of sexual violence, we actually found no differences in outcomes between populations who reported and populations who didn't. So they looked the same in terms of access of health services, access to mental health services, as well as self-reported psychological distress and life satisfaction. So no differences there. Now, the third research question that we had, which I didn't mention previously, was wanting to better understand the types of biases that might be introduced to policy and to decision making by only relying on administrative data sets. So taking what we found in terms of what are some of the findings that we get by incorporating some of that hidden picture of family and sexual violence, what might it mean for developing interventions just based on officially reported incidents alone? And based on what we found, there are a couple of key implications. So first of all, as Apriel said, particularly the case for sexual violence, and we also found this for family violence too, the more severe the incident, the more likely it's going to be reported. And that's something that Devon had mentioned is also found across the international literature. And so our formally reported offences may skew perceptions of what normative violence looks like towards that higher level. And it might mean that a lot of our legislation, our access to services, for instance, may exclude people who are experiencing some of those less severe forms of harm, but who still need access to services. So that may be one thing that's happening by a focus just on formally reported offences. The other thing that came out more so in the family violence than in the and then in the sexual violence sample was that people who had lower levels of deprivation tended to report less. So again, that may be skewing some of our picture of who the normative victim or survivor is towards more highly deprived populations. And again, somewhat hidden from us is the forms of family violence that's happening within less deprived areas, potentially. Coming back to that question of well-being, so very little difference between the groups. And again, it's really hard for us to say why. The IDI, the Crime and Victim Survey, gives us really interesting and useful information, but it obviously doesn't dig down into more of that day-to-day or psychosocial functioning of people in our sample. So it may be good news in that whether or not people are reporting, they seem to be able to access supports they need. However, it could also be that, as Devon mentioned, maybe we're not seeing any difference in, say, life satisfaction or distress because people who don't report aren't getting access to services, and people who do report are then being pushed through a criminal justice system, which is re-traumatizing and creating distress, for instance. So we really can't tell what's going on exactly from our data. Just to say that it doesn't seem from the variables that we looked at that outcomes are significantly better for people who do report to authorities. So I think what this highlights is that, there's multiple different pieces of the puzzle that come together to try and address family harm and sexual harm in our communities. And it's really important that we focus on making services and supports accessible for people who choose not to report to formal authorities, that we make sure that there's as many doors and pathways open as possible, including helping to support family, whānau, friends to feel like they're able to provide some of that more informal level of support that people might be seeking following the offending. So I want to say thank you, first of all, to the survey respondents. Of course, this isn't possible without them being willing to share their experiences. Would also like to thank Sergeant Williamson and Sol from New Zealand Police, who helped us with some of the and are continuing to support us in understanding some of the policy implications of this work. The New Zealand Crime and Victims Survey at the Ministry of Justice, who funded the research, including Dr. Daly, who's supported us a lot along the way in terms of data access and understanding. And I should add the disclaimer at this point that these are not official statistics. It's based on the IDI, but everything we've presented is based on our work and our opinion. And here's some references.